This is a story of a man thrust into an unimaginable fate. In the heart of the 19th century slave trade, he was forced into a life of breeding over 200 slaves. His journey is one of profound suffering, unexpected resilience, and a fight for dignity against all odds. Dive into this harrowing tale of endurance and defiance that sheds light on one of history's darkest chapters. The farming industry suddenly saw an unprecedented boom in the 19th century. It grew so big and profitable that there was not enough workforce to cultivate the fields. With the route to Africa cut off, the enslavers were left with one final resolution: slave breeding. During this dark period, enslaved Africans were on par with cattle, taken as mere domestic animals meant to till the land, harvest cotton, and breed more workers. It was indeed an inhuman time, but from the dust raised from the sweat and blood spilled on the floor by the grieving slaves, the legendary Pata Seca rose. Born as Roque José Florêncio in 1828 in Sorocaba, São Paulo, back when Brazil was still a Portuguese colony, Pata Seca was captured and enslaved from a young age. Transported across the colony like livestock, the young boy was forced to labor with adult slaves because of his remarkable body features. With an incredible height of 2.18 meters, thin legs, large hands and feet, Roque was so agile that he could walk on hot soil without discomfort. This unparalleled endurance level made some people believe that he had a skin ailment that made his skin so dry that he could barely feel the scorching sun beneath his feet, while others thought that he was so dry-footed that his captors could quickly lose track of him. Indeed, everyone was so fascinated by him that they named him Pata Seca, which means dry foot in Portuguese. Pata Seca had a special relationship with Francisco da Cunha Bueno, a white man who bore pride in his plantation. The enslaver trusted him so much that he allowed him to handle minor tasks like delivering the mail and caring for the farm animals. As a reward for being loyal and hardworking, Pata Seca did not have to travel between the rural villages and the city of São Carlos on foot. His master gave him access to a beast of burden. The merits of being the master's favorite did not just stop there. The agile slave lived a life that would be called luxurious by his brothers and sisters, bound in chains. He also held a leadership position and did not work in the fields or live in slave houses. So, what did Pata Seca do exactly? Well, back then, it was believed that a man with long and slender legs would likely give birth to male children. Pata Seca and many other well-built men went from being idle beasts of labor to the perfect specimen for cloning. The slave masters had the plan to turn them into super breeders that would balance the farm cultivation and farm labor ratio. Being a strong man who exuded charm, intelligence, and bravery, stood at 7 feet tall and weighed about 3 pounds, Francisco did not hesitate to utilize his favorite slave. Pata Seca was well-fed, monitored, and cared for. He even had to undergo regular medical checkups to ensure he was in the best condition to breed. Stuck on a foreign man's land, the legend was forced into a life of endless, unprotected intercourse with several enslaved women to preserve his life. It is believed that Pata Seca fathered about 30% of the current population of the Santa Eudoxia region. Farming journals and his existing family confirmed that he had about 249 children with different women. However, Pata Seca still managed to show affection to all his children. Children born from these tragic relationships were treated like livestock by their owners. Once they reached a certain age, they were forcibly taken from their mothers. They were first turned into house slaves who did housework and worked long hours. Their meals and growth were also controlled to make sure they were ready to be sold as commodities in the slave market, or were strong enough to be slave breeders like their fathers. This must have been very traumatic for these kids, and as they grew, they lost every sense of self-value. On the other hand, recognizing that they were treated no differently from animals, the inhumane experience slowly brewed an aggressive urge to join slavery revolts. Pata Seca taught his kids essential skills like fighting and survival. Aware that he had covertly raised an army, he finally launched a rebellion against the plantation owners, starting with Francisco da Cunha Bueno. And this movement rapidly became a grand revolt to liberate slaves across the country. The revolt had become successful, and most of the African population had regained their freedom thanks to the visionary leader. Before Pata Seca, there were few cases of slave rebellion in Brazil. One of the earliest and most significant was the Haitian Revolution. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and other black soldiers led the movement in Rio de Janeiro in 1805 by wearing medallion portraits of the Emperor Dessalines. Many enslaved Africans were imported and settled in the Bahia region during that period to satisfy the growing sugar demand worldwide. From 1807 to 1835, Jean-Jacques and his groups led several revolts in Bahia. In one of these revolts, the enslaved people who escaped from Santana in Bahia sent a peace proposal to their former enslaver that they would return if they were guaranteed better working conditions. Still, it didn't work out well for them. Since the resistance could not arm its population and cover a large area, their activities were limited, and most of the time, the enslaved people revolted by either slowing work down or committing suicide, while most just ran away aimlessly. In the end, the Haitian Revolution ended as a failed dream, or as the world thought. But another group was learning from their predecessors' mistakes in the shadows. An African-born Muslim ethnic group of slaves, commonly known as the Malay, started the largest slave uprising in Salvador in 1835. Even though an Islamic community started the movement, African slaves of all ethnicities and religions were ready to fight to the death. After years of planning and studying the military system in Bahia, the Malays planned to liberate all the slaves in the region and then form a larger army that would take on the whole country. They had all the elements of victory except for one last thing: the commitment of the Brazilian-born slaves. Even while being oppressed, the enslaved could not ultimately unify amongst themselves, and this dare mistake would cost the jeopardy of the movement, as all 300 rebels involved, including 250 enslaved Africans and freemen, were apprehended. Records have it that 40% of the population in Bahia was made of both Brazilian slaves and ex-slaves, but amongst the members of the resistance captures, only 2 were mulattoes and 3 were Brazilian-born blacks. The military men used to put a halt to the revolution were mulatto troops. What was more surprising was that no Brazilian blacks participated in the last 20 revolts in the region before the 1835 revolt. The movement was meant to be a success naturally, but the masters had seen steps ahead. For years, they got into the heads of the slaves by creating a rift between the enslaved Africans and Afro-Brazilian slaves by favoring the mulattoes and native Brazilian slaves better. This strategic move can be said to be coincidental, as stated by Luis dos Santos Vilhena around 1798. If African slaves are treacherous, and mulattoes are even more so, and if not for the rivalry between the former and the latter, all the political power and social order would crumble before a servile revolt. Some of the slaves who had escaped earlier in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries formed maroon settlements, which are known as quilombos. These settlements were more like camps, and the colonial masters saw them as threats, so they continually raided them, trying to stop them from unifying and causing an awful revolt. Still, on the agenda to stop these men in chains from taking back their rights, Native Americans were hired as slave catchers to violently raid and torch quilombos, and as time went on, these settlements were destroyed. During the Haitian Revolution, José Bonifacio de Andrade e Silva, the father of Brazilian independence, argued for the abolition of the slave trade and the gradual emancipation of enslaved people to prevent future bloodshed. However, blinded by their insatiable desire for more slaves, the enslavers failed to see the formidable black army rising. The turbulent waters needed a leader to guide them, and that's when the legendary Pata Seca, the father of many, stepped in. The tables turned to favor the blacks as they began planning significant revolts. They would once again form quilombos in various parts of Brazil and attack slave owners with the intent to destroy everything they stood for and owned. Pernambuco, the 5th largest sugarcane producer in Brazil, also became home to the unchained people that Pata Seca liberated. Between 1877 and 1878, the slave owners had to battle the revolters and faced a new nemesis, the Grande Seca, which translates to the Great Drought. Owing an enslaved person in these times brought only destruction by the resistance and financial loss for feeding. Hence, the enslavers decided to part ways with their most profitable slaves by selling them. But that just wasn't enough as the revolts continued. Seeing that there was no way out, slavery was finally banned in the province of Ceará by 1884. At this point, over 15% of the country's population were black, and 3/4 of them were free. Now a freeman and respected in the free black community, Pata Seca finally found true love when he crossed paths with his wife, Palmyra. He secured 20 pieces of land and then started a family with her. They gave birth to 9 children. The struggle for total liberation continued until 1888, when the Princess Imperial of Brazil, Isabella, intervened in what is today known as Lei Áurea, which translates to the Golden Act. Brazil became the last nation in the Western world to altogether abolish slavery, and before then, most slave owners had already cashed out on their most profitable slaves. They had already sold about 40% to Americans for ridiculous amounts. The fearless Pata Seca lived through both world wars, witnessed the War of the Triple Alliance, Brazil's independence, the coffee export boom, and the Revolution of 1930, something he was very familiar with. With slavery abolished, Seca became a farmer to build a new life for his family. He owned and managed his farm, Sítio Pata Seca. There, he worked tirelessly on producing and selling rapadura, a solid form of unrefined cane sugar. Although his income was modest, he used it to support his family and dream of a brighter tomorrow. He died peacefully on June 13, 1958, at the age of 130, having lived an extraordinarily long and impressive life. Every year on June 13th, his descendants gather to honor his memory and try to preserve his legacy and history from the harsh reality of slavery. Article 68 of Brazil's 1988 Constitution declared that the remaining quilombos were granted collective ownership of the lands they had occupied since colonial times. From the time this decree came into law until 2016, about 294 villages had applied to be recognized as quilombos because they were founded by escaped slaves and are mainly inhabited by their descendants. However, despite how long it has been since the law came to be and how many villages have applied, just 152 have been recognized as quilombos, because the certification process thus far has been slow. Thanks for watching to the end. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates. And while you're still here, click the next video on your screen to see the fascinating story of the Black Rebel tribe they tried to write out of history.